I don't really remember when I first learned about Google's PageRank, but I still remember what the thought that went through my head when it happened. And the first thing that occurred to me when I realized how Google organizes websites is that, well, this is really how people work. We really evaluate each other the same way as Google ranks websites in a very fundamental way. And ever since then, I've been thinking that eventually somebody has to build an equivalent algorithm for people, that it just is bound to happen because that's the way it works. But it's been over a decade, and for most of this time I kept coming back to this idea, and every time I was thinking about this, I realized that I don't really know how this would happen because we don't really have enough data to make it work. And this changed roughly 2 years ago. I started working with a small team, mathematician, developer, and we started running the first experiments. And now I'm convinced that it's finally possible to build. But before I can share more, I have to tell you a story of this tweet. A while back, Kylie Jenner tweeted that she doesn't use Snap anymore. And what followed was that the Snapchat stock dropped by $1.6 billion the next day. And the media reported that Kylie Jenner, with one tweet, she took away over $1 billion in market cap of this company. And it's debatable, how much can be really attributed to that tweet. But what's hard to debate is that there are some online identities these days that have tremendous amount of influence over the real world, the world that's outside of these platforms where they exist. But there are many others, in fact, most of them, who have practically no influence. They have no weight. They say something, nobody listens. So it's becoming increasingly a big problem. How do we tell them apart? And especially that the number of these identities is growing exponentially. So there are already hundreds of millions of people using hundreds of millions of accounts or identities on using Twitter. There are tens of millions on GitHub, 500 million on Reddit, over 1 billion on Instagram, even more so on YouTube. And there is a countless number of other platforms where you also have fast-growing number of identities. And some of them use the same name that people behind them use in the real world. Some of them are pseudonymous. Some of them exist only in one context, some of them exist in multiple contexts. It's perhaps worth taking a short pause here to explain what I mean by identity. An identity is a collective set of ideas that people have about you in a given context, right? So you have an identity right here in this context right now. You have an identity in your office, you have an identity with your family, you have an identity with your friends. And when you use Twitter or Reddit, you also have an identity on these platforms. They serve as a context. And sometimes your identity will span across multiple different contexts. Sometimes it might be limited to, let's say, one platform. But as long as it's the same set of collective ideas that coalesce around specific identifier, set of identifiers, it's one identity. And because there's so many of them and they're so influential, we're trying to make sense of them. And there's no day that goes by these days without a listing of influencers in this or that field or this or that platform. Really what this reminds me of is this. A long time ago, when the internet was still small, we used to make sense of it. We used to organize it in a very different way. There were directories with arbitrary categories where websites were put into by a combination of humans and machines. And this worked really, really well when we had a small number of websites on the internet. But when the numbers started growing to tens of millions, hundreds of millions and more, this solution didn't work anymore. So then replaced with this. PageRank. So what Larry Page and Sergey Brin realized is that you don't really have to put websites in arbitrary categories. You don't have to build algorithms that can tell which websites has the better content or worse content. All you need to do is to try to look at how other websites are relating to that website. So if you're looking for the best website about fishing, all you need to know is to look at what other websites about fishing are linking to, and eventually you will find a website that seems to be sitting in the top of that specific category. And of course, as well as Google that we use every day. But how does this relate to organized identities? we created our own algorithm that's analogous in principle to how PageRank works. We call it tongue-in-cheek people rank. And if you imagine this as a graph, Google created a graph of web addresses, where each node is an address, and this node connects to other nodes by web links. In our graph, the nodes are identifiers, or like they become identities, and they're connected by attention transfers. Now, this reflects the way that groups of people work. And I've struggled for a long time to try to explain this in an easy-to-digest way. And I realized that probably the best example comes from my personal experience. So a couple of years back, I used to do improv theater. And for those of you who don't know, it's a form of performance where a group of improvisers goes to stage and get a suggestion from the audience and on the spot create some story out of that suggestion. And in order to be able to do that, we would have a bunch of different exercises. And one of these exercises was called pecking order. The way it works is that a group of improvisers goes on stage and there is somebody who has the highest status, usually referred as the boss, and then there's going to be two people with lower status, we call them Bs, and then two people with even lower status, Cs. Now, when boss speaks, everybody listens. Their body language turns into to the boss. When Bs speak, Cs listen, the boss is kind of listening, kind of ignoring. And when Cs speak, nobody really pays attention to them. They get ignored most of the time. And this is really how groups of people work. When there's a next break, you can actually observe yourself. You can take a step back and try to look at groups that will form. And if you pay close attention, you'll be able to spot those people who have the highest status in a given group. And the way it will materialize itself is through body language and the amount of attention this person is receiving from that group. The really interesting thing is, a group of any size works this way. In fact, a group that communicates in any way you can imagine works this way. So not only these people who will form groups in the garden in an hour or so work this way, but also groups on Twitter, in any other platform work the same way, and it can be 5 people, it can be 500 or 5 million people. The hierarchy, your status in the group is going to be determined by the amount of attention you're receiving from other people in the group, and how much attention the people who are giving you attention are receiving from other members of the group, and so on, so on, so on. So status can be expressed mathematically. The problem is that if you're talking to a bunch of people in the yard over there, I cannot put a chip in your brain to record these signals. But when this communication happens over a pipe, there are two people sitting in different parts of the planet and talking to each other over Twitter or other platform, the whole communication, 100%, goes through this pipe. So the signals of who pays attention to whom flow through this pipe, and we might not know how to decipher them, but they're there. So it's just a technical challenge of understanding, figuring out who's the signal, but it's possible. The problem is that most groups that are valuable, most ecosystems, communities, form around geographical proximity, which means that most of their communication happens face-to-face, or at least a substantial portion of the important communication happens face-to-face, which means that we cannot really gather enough signal to build that mapping. And for the first time, it seems like there are groups that are valuable enough, and yet the communication happens through these digital channels, that we can build something that works. And that's crypto ecosystems. What's really special about crypto ecosystems is that they form primarily first online, and as they grow, they cluster more and more on geographical proximity, like we have now the ecosystem here in Berlin, but really where it starts online, which means that the majority of the communication happens through digital channels. And at the same time, these groups are very valuable. So starting with this hypothesis, 2 years ago, we designed the first prototype of the algorithm, and we tried to figure out who are the most influential people in crypto. We published this as an anonymously as a website, and the purpose of this was to validate or falsify our hypothesis. So we quickly ran into the problem that, okay, if we really did create an algorithm that works, the first algorithm that can tell you which people are influential in a group, And how do we check that? Well, there's no benchmark. No single human can really look at this list and say this is accurate or this is inaccurate. So the experiment that we designed was, okay, create a list, show it to a very large number of members of that group, and then quantify the responses. Basically, the assumption is that if the list is incorrect, then nobody can tell about the whole list, but you will know at least 5 or 6 people well enough that if Alice is, like if John is above Alice, then you know this is incorrect because you know that Alice is more influential than John. So we assume that if we create an incorrect list, we would have a bunch of people telling us this is bullshit and this doesn't work. But what happened was that we received hundreds and hundreds of tweets saying basically, holy shit, this is the first list that works. I'm surprised this is accurate. And this is the first time when I thought, okay, wow, we can really build this. So since then, we added more functionality. We ran the website to hide that one, and now there's some cool stuff that you can do, searching different lists and analyzing different groups. But really, this is just a demo of what can be built with this, and we're trying to attract some attention. What's really important about this project is that attention is a source of scarcity. Attention is ultimately scarce. And the reason it is that it's an expression of your cognitive ability. Your brain, like a computer, is a flexible computation machine. It can switch between different types of computations. So I can look at a string of numbers and find a pattern in these numbers, or I can learn how to ride a bike, or I can think what I'm going to make myself for dinner the next day. And I can easily switch between these different types of intelligence, between these different computations, but every time I try to perform one of them, I have to use up attention. And I can switch between them, I cannot do them at the same time. In this way, our brains are very similar to computers, but which also can switch between different computations, but they need electricity. So in this sense, attention is an equivalent of electricity. So we can introduce it's a new way of introducing scars into decentralized systems. Let me give you some examples of what practical applications that we think it might have. So the first one is obviously decentralized identity. The problem with decentralized identity, truly decentralized identity, is that no decentralized identity system yet has been able to solve the decentralized identity trilemma. Which is that you would expect from truly decentralized identity system 3 characteristics. It should be privacy preserving, it should be self-sovereign, and it should be civil resistant. But these 3 exclude each other. So you can easily have a system that's privacy preserving and self-sovereign, but then it's not going to be civil resistant. You can fix the civil resistance part, for instance, by requiring KYCs and using IDs or passports, but then it's no longer privacy preserving nor self-sovereign. And it's true for every single identity system that I've seen so far. But if you have a source of scarcity that's derived from your cognitive ability, that does not require relinquishing your name, or in fact being reduced to just one identifier, then you can fulfill all 3 of these criteria. And where it leads us is that, well, now if you have a truly decentralized identity system or reputation system, well then why not fix decentralized credit? The problem with decentralized credit today is that it's super expensive. I'm actually very generous with this slide because usually you need to provide way more collateral than you want to take a loan, which results in a very small number of use cases because it's applicable to a very small number of things. But if you could lower the amount of collateral that you require for taking a loan, suddenly the number of use cases explodes. So if we can add social capital to that, then suddenly there's a far, far, far bigger market for decentralized credit. Then there's decentralized ownership, something I'm personally particularly excited about. There has been many attempts at decentralized ownership in projects, and many people in this conference probably have tried that as well. But then we run into something I call crowdfunding paradox. So the more of the decentralized ownership there is, the more you have to give up on value add. The average investor is going to get less value add. If you optimize for value add investors, then less decentralized ownership. And you can't really truly solve the paradox because always if you go into one or the other extreme, you have to sacrifice the other. But you can find the golden middle. And with a graph like we're designing, in theory, you can identify a number of groups that are the most relevant for your project, and then you can programmatically distribute ownership between members of these groups proportionally to the level of influence in those groups. So within a second, you can distribute your ownership in your project to millions and millions of people, and it's going to be proportional to the potentially the level of support that they can provide to you, how much they can actually affect whether it's successful or not. That's never been possible. Then we can build Google for people. Google is great for surfacing information. If you're looking for quantum physics, type into Google, you're going to get great results. If you're looking for who is the best quantum physicist right now in the world, Google is not really help you. If you want to learn more about cancer, you type into cancer to Google, you're going to get great results. If you actually have, well, if you need a doctor, if you need an oncologist, then Google cannot help you find the best oncologist. It's not really good at this. Search engine based on a graph of identities could actually answer these questions really well. And then finally, perhaps the most important application of all, universal social graph, or to put it differently, disrupting Facebook and friends. The problem with Facebook and all other platforms is not that they're big. Breaking up these companies is not going to solve anything. The problem is this: if you want to leave Facebook, the cost of you leaving this platform is very high for you, and it's marginal for Facebook. And this creates a very bad dynamic. And the reason it is so is that all social media platforms are structured right now vertically. So you have a UI layer at the top, and then you have a graph layer, and they're all connected. You cannot separate them. So when you leave Facebook, you have to start building your graph from scratch on another platform, but Facebook gets to keep all the information about the relationships between you and other people, and this is what's valuable. But what if we separated these two? What if a social media platform, at least what we think of when we say that, was just a UI sitting on a universal graph, and now if you decide to leave Facebook, you go to some other social media platform, all of your graph goes with you, and Facebook loses access to that part of the graph? Well, this would happen. If it's extremely expensive for Facebook to lose you, but it's a marginal cost for you to leave Facebook, then suddenly there are completely different incentives, and the platform has to care deeply about what you think and what you care about, rather than what's happening today. But if you find this convincing, and if, let's say, in the future we manage to build such a graph, then there's a very important question that comes up. Who controls that graph? So right now, I think many of us are justifiably worried how much power Mark Zuckerberg has and a couple of other CEOs of big social media companies. But what if one graph controls it all? I don't think any human should have that amount of power. And I wouldn't want to have that amount of power. So if we're successful in building that, it's paramount that we decentralize this graph, both the ownership and governance of the graph. And we have some ideas how to go about that yet, but it's going to be a long process. We see this as a multi-year project, but from the get-go, the only way we can imagine building that is with the end goal of decentralizing that kind of graph. Thank you. If you guys want to stay in touch with the project, see how it's developing, still super early on, you can leave your email address on weirborg.co and we'll keep you posted. Thank you very much. I think we have time for one question. There's 1 minute. Yeah, just go ahead.
We're also working on a decentralized identity graph for the Postage report. Mm-hmm. And one of the biggest issues that we have and everyone has is what you're talking about, having centralized control over this particular aspect. And I don't think there's any good way of being able to do, or at least I haven't found a good way of to create as complete a graph model as, say, Facebook has or Google has, without removing the permissions part of it. But I do think that there are a lot of ways where you can create very valuable, smaller permission graph models in control of users.
I don't think you have to sacrifice that privacy. I think that you can collect enough data from purely public sources, but there needs to be an incentive for people to create these publicly available information. And I don't know if you're familiar with the network effects that Google had in the early years, but the SEO industry was the first network effects of Google. So the more people who use Google, the more traffic it sent to website owners, the more website owners were incentivized to optimize their websites for Google to make it easier to index. The easier it was to index for Google, the better the search engine became, the more people used it, the more incentive there was for website owners. So we see this similarly. If we publish the scores that people care about, or more importantly, that people that you care about your score, then you will care about making sure that there's enough data to index you properly, right? And that's the forcing function that pulls more and more information into the public eye that's without sacrificing anybody's privacy, without infringing any of private data. You just create an incentive for people to create these identities in such a way that is indexable. All right, thank you very much.